Hi, I'm Phil Lowe at the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is the art of woodworking. Today, what I'd like to do is to show you a few things about carving. You know, carving's been around for quite a bit of time. Some of the earliest carving was actually done almost 450,000 years ago when they discovered, a wooden spear that the Paleolithic man had actually carved out in order to kill an elephant and a hippopotamus. And throughout time, tools and techniques and so forth have changed from using stone type tools all the way through to the Iron Age, and which is where it brings us today. What I'd like to do is to really show you some simple techniques of carving so that if you want to get started at this, I'll show you how to do that. So let me get some of this stuff out of the way and we'll begin. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is show you some of the tools involved in carving. If you actually bought a whole set of carving tools, you might end up spending, thousands of dollars, and you'd almost end up with 1,000 tools. And the reason for that is a lot of the tools are very specific to very specific jobs. For instance, furniture carving tools are certainly different than carving life-size figures. So what you see here on the bench is a variety of tools that I've collected over the years, and what I'd like to do first is just show you what the tools are. And if we start off, usually these tools are numbered. They're 1 through 25, 26, somewhere around there. And the number ones are actually tools that are basically straight across this way. And if you look at this particular tool, it has a bevel on both sides, whereas this one here actually has a single bevel on one side. And you can use, these are used for different purposes. But you'll also notice that these are of different width. We also have some really narrow ones, which are quite narrow. And on some of these tool handles, you'll find that they actually have a number on them. Let me see if I can grab one of these newer tools. So if you look at these numbers on the handle, the number 7 determines the curvature of the blade, and the number 20 determines the width of the blade. So with that being said, you'll notice that these 3 tools here range in size from about 3/8 of an inch to an inch to about 1 1/8 inches, somewhere around there. The next series of tools would be a number 2, which would be a, let's see what we got here. A number, I thought we had these in order. Yeah, number 2 here is, as you can see, this is quite narrow. And we also have one that is relatively wide. So this is a number 212, so it indicates that the 2 is actually the curvature and the 12 is the width. And then we have a really small, probably about 1/8 inch wide, number 2 as well. So as we go through these different sizes, you'll notice that with each number, we'll jump up to a number 3 here, you'll notice that the curvature on these start to increase. So the 3s are going to have a little bit more, and if we go over to a number, let's see which way we headed here, let's say a number 5, we'll pull this one out, the 3 and the 5, if you can actually see the ends of these, you'll notice that the curvature increases as the numbers go up. So if I jump up to like a number 7, which this one here is quite wide. This is a 725, as opposed to the number 5. You'll see the difference in the curvature of the blade. So if we're trying to, do different designs and so forth, we can incorporate some of these curves in order to create, the shapes of the curves that we're trying to develop. So I could certainly use, something like this, a tool like this would cut a certain shape in one direction, and then use another tool in the opposite direction to get a softer curve. So, but also you'll notice that there's a number of other types of tools that are involved in here as well. So if we work our way up, the number 9s, which are, these, the 8s and the 9s. Let's see, this is an 8. Let's see, this is a number 8. Here's a number 9 here. The number 8 is almost just shy of a half circle, and the number 9 is just about a half circle. If you look at it directly in from the front, the distance from here to here is about whatever width this is, just say it's a ½ inch. The distance from up here down to the edge is about 1/4 inch. And with the 8, it's a little bit less than that. So, you have to get used to the numbers and the widths that you're going to use in order to, try to create the work that you're doing. Now, there's a few other tools here that are sort of specialty tools. The specialty tools are, tools like you see here. Now, what this is, these are what they call straight gouges, which are, perfectly straight in this direction. And then also you have these bent gouges. And these bent gouges are actually used to, go down inside of, a hollow in order to, to be able to take the material away, as opposed to a straight one. Whereas if I tried to cut into a hollow, what happens is the edge becomes engaged, the back of the chisel starts to hit, and actually makes it jump, so you don't get a smooth cut. So, these are very specific. This happens to be a V tool, which is actually, at, a couple of angles that you might have here. And then we have a couple of bent gouges. This is a 7 and an 8. And again, the 7 is a little shallower and the 8 is a little deeper. So now, there's also a couple of other different types of tools, which are what we call spoon gouges. Now, if you look at this particular one here, the spoon actually, if you look at it, it's almost like a spoon. You're going to eat with it or something like that. So it's a real radical bend right on the end of the tool, as opposed to a long bend that has got a really long, that's why they call them a long bend. It's got a long bend over the length of it. So, these are for, getting down inside of really acute areas, like that ball and claw foot that I was working on when we first started out. So if I was to use this tool, down inside of here, what that allows me to do is make a nice sweeping cut, right down from this web right into the ankle. Whereas if I tried to use a straight gouge, what would happen is it would hit here and it would start to jump and make it for a much more difficult cut. Now, a couple other tools that we have here. We have spoon skews, which are an interesting tool. If we can get a close-up of these two right here, you'll notice that we have a left and a right spoon skew. So what this means is that it's a spoon with an angle on the end. So a skew chisel, which if we looked at a straight skew, it's basically the same, but it has the same angle involved. But in this situation, it has the the spoon, so that you can again reach down into deep places when you're doing really a deep carving. Now, one of the other specialty tools that we have is what we call a fishtail, and you can see here that I have a number 1 fishtail and a number 7 fishtail. And these fishtails, come out and they spread out on the ends. And this actually works quite well when you have to work in against some of the designs that you're working for, or to get in an acute corner or something like that. These are really very handy, and you'll notice that I'll go to these quite often when we start to do our carving. Now, another couple of real peculiar tools is this is what they call a dog leg. As you can see, it's the bevel is on the top here, and it's got a really acute angle, relatively flat, and this is to work in against the surface of some work, so you can help to flatten out the background. Now, another interesting tool here is what we call a back bent gouge. Now, the difference between a back bend and a spoon is where, let me grab one that's a little bit wider here. If we have a spoon gouge, you'll notice if I flip this over, there's a bevel on the underside, and it's flat on the top, where the back bent, which we call this one, is flat on the underside and has the bevel on the top. And this is actually used to, go over the top of things in order to lift the handle up. A lot of times, if we're making cuts across, the surface of a piece, the handle can become involved in the work that we're doing. So the idea of having that handle angled up in this direction as we're making our cuts, we don't have any difficulty with the handle getting in the way. Okay, we got a couple other funny ones here as well. This is what they call a winged V-tool, or I should probably point out a V-tool to begin with. A V-tool, first of all, is a tool that's in the shape of a V. And as you can see, we have different widths as well as different heights as well. We also have various angles. You'll notice that the angle on this particular one is a little bit, more vertical than the one alongside of it. This might even show it a little bit better. So if you look at the difference between these two, this one's almost a 90-degree V, where this one might be a 45-degree V. But the numbers on the ends of these indicate the actual angle of the V's. So with that, we have the winged V tool, which actually, instead of this surface being straight, it actually has a curvature to it. I don't know if you can see that or not on here. Can you get in close on that? All right. So that's a winged V tool. Then we also have what they call a macaroni tool, which is sort of strange. It's got a flat bottom with vertical sides, so they're very at right angles to one another. And this is for cleaning up along your design so that you can get a vertically straight wall and then also a good flat background. Okay, and then the last tool that we have here is there's one that's a little misshapen as far as the curve goes. It's actually a little flatter on the bottom and then have these heavy curves towards the end. And this is a number 24-8. But as you can see, there's a variety of different tools. And let me just grab some paperwork here, and I'll show you the number of tools that actually can be bought. Okay, if you take a look at this brochure here, these are all the different types of tools that you can buy. So for instance, the number 1s in the 2s, you can buy in a straight chisel, a skew chisel, a spoon chisel, a skew spoon chisel, right, a spoon skew chisel left, and then a fishtail. So if there's 19 of these lines on here, that indicates that I can buy 19 of this tool, 19 of that tool, 19 of this one, so on and so forth. So just this one, number 1s that I can buy almost 114 tools. So these lines are actually in the numbers alongside here, indicate the widths that you're buying them in. The lines also indicate the curvature. So if I jump from the 1 to the 2 down to the 3, you can see that the angle or the curve is starting to increase with each one of the numbers. So the number 4, it gets a little more increased. The 5, the 6, 7, and when you get up towards the 8 and the 9, they're extremely curved. Now, one of the chisels that I didn't show you was these number 11s, which actually go beyond the half round. And if you look at these, they're actually more of a U shape than they are a half round. So, they're curved at the bottom and they extend up along the sides, creating a U shape as opposed to a half round. So these are used for setting in, going around motifs, or trying to relieve material. So when we go to set in, which means cut in right up against the line, the wall collapses easy, and then we don't have trouble with things breaking. So you also see that there's a variety of different tools. There's a 100-degree V tool, there's a 60-degree V tool, and a 75-degree V tool. So as you can see, I figured it out here at one point. You can buy 979 tools if you would like, but most carvers would never have that many. Okay, let me clean this off, and then we'll get started on showing you a few basic cuts. Okay, what I have now is before we start carving any kind of motif or anything, we need to choose a material that we're going to work in. So what I've done here is assembled a bunch of woods that are used quite frequently in carving. And some of the more recognizable ones are pine, which this is Eastern white pine, which is really quite beautiful, especially if you work in between the knots. We also have some oak. You could also, with the oak, you could use either red or white. White tends to carve a little bit better, and it's wood that you find mostly in ecclesiastical work, meaning church work. We also have cherry, which is a local species, which is quite nice. It has beautiful color, a little harder to carve than some of the softer woods like the pine. We have another one that is another fruit wood, which is actually pear wood, which is European pear. It, as you can see, it's a little creamier in color and a little bit more even textured. And this is a real delight to carve because of the crispness of it when you actually start to cut with it. Another domestic wood would be walnut. The walnut trees that you get your walnuts from. It has a beautiful color, tends to be a little on the harder side, but holds detail really well and has a beautiful color to it. One of the things you want to try and avoid, though, is any materials that have any kind of figure in it. People talk about bird's eye maple or crotch mahogany or something like that. Those are very difficult woods to carve, so you want to try to stay with as straight grained of material as possible. Some of the other domestic woods this is poplar. Or sometimes what they call a whitewood. With the poplar, though, you can find, there are a couple of different species of trees, but they categorize them into what they call whitewood or poplar. But you notice that this piece of poplar tends to be a little greener. If you're after any material, part of the problem is the color affects, the motif. Whereas if you want something to be nice and bright and white, a light-colored poplar or whitewood would work a lot better than this. But the green material actually carves a lot better than the white material. And then we have some exotic woods. This is a Port Orford cedar, which again is a very beautiful smelling wood. Comes from the western part of the country, but it has a really it's light and has a really nice texture to it. Even grain, not very porous. And it's a delight to work with. Some of the more difficult materials that you find are, this happens to be satinwood, which comes from Ceylon, or what now is Sri Lanka. And it's a really dense wood, very difficult to carve, but the results, if you you cut things evenly and smoothly, you get really crisp definition, but it's a lot more difficult to work. As well as the most dark wood, which is ebony. Ebony comes from Gabon, Africa, and there's also some other types of ebony, such as Macassar ebony and African blackwood, but these are, beautiful materials as far as color goes. But again, the density and the darkness of this makes it much more difficult to work. We have a couple of different types of boxwood. Boxwood tends to be more like a bush, but it has a beautiful texture to it. Again, it's harder. This is really great for figure carving and material that you want to get extremely nice little fine detail with. And there's also what they call Castello boxwood, which as you can see is a little different in color. It tends to be a little tanner, browner, whereas the original boxwood has this really nice yellow color to it. You find some of the Asian carvings that they will do a lot of figurines and so forth are done in boxwood, and they're absolutely superb. Okay, then one of the favorites of most carvers is mahogany. There's lots of different types of mahogany. You find that this is Switina macrophylla, which comes from Honduras, South America, maybe Brazil, places like that. There's also another type of mahogany called Switina mahogany, which is Cuban mahogany, Santo Domingan mahogany, which is a completely different species, but they're all very similar. And the difference between them is that this is a little bit more open pored, and the detail that you can get with this particular material isn't quite as refined as the material that you get from the Switina mahogany or the Cuban or Santo Domingan mahogany. All right, I'm going to get these out of the way, and maybe what we should do is look at some different types of carving next. Okay, what I've done here is I've gathered a few different types of carving that I can show you. Carving is sort of classified into different depths of cut. Some of the real primitive carving was done with either something that could scratch, something into the surface of a board, or cut. So when the primitive man was decorating his weapons and utilitarian items that they might use to eat with and so forth, they'd take a piece of flint and they would, cut notches into the edge or something like that. It wasn't until the Bronze Age where they figured out that they could take copper and tin and mix it together, that they could make any kind of a tool that they could actually get some type of a cutting edge on. And at that was still a pretty soft piece of metal, but they were able to do some really fabulous work with those types of tools. It wasn't until later on when we developed into the Iron Age where we were able to make metals that were much stronger, is when carving really exploded. So with some of the primitive carving, what you find is some of the real early stuff is what we call incised carving. And if you focus in on, a couple of these little lines here, incised indicates what's going on. It's actually incised or cut into the surface of the board without any relief or taking of any material around. So you notice that this little branch and this little swirl are carving that is incised into the surface of the board. So that's the most primitive type. And then once they started going beyond that, they started to do what they call chip carving. And chip carving is a series of usually geometric designs that, as you can see here, it has this little circle with this six-sided figure in the center with these triangles inside of that, and with some incised carving on the surface in between each one of the triangles. And then little chips of material were taken from the outside, and then you can see that it was accented by these curve cuts. And then on the ends of the top here, we have almost like this fish scaling taking place, and then the same representation of the triangle on the ends, and some incised cuts going around the outside of it. Then they also use some different decoration on the front, where they use these crisscrosses that were incised with some lines, and then some simple triangles that left a triangle inside of it. You know, half circles, so on and so forth. So you can get pretty creative with these sort of things. And there's lots of simple cuts. Now these cuts that are made on here, now even the back is a little different than the front. This is a great little box that Sandra found you know, at some junk shop someplace, and she just couldn't pass it up. She cleaned it up a little bit, and it's really, you know, the amount of work that went into this little object, it's really quite remarkable. But once you have, once you go beyond the chip carving, then you start going into some of the naturalistic carving, or what you might call low relief carving. And this is a really good example of what a low relief carving might be. These are a couple of brackets that I've carved, which could be used on a shelf. But the design, you know, we have a little rosette with a flower in the center of it, with some sea scrolls and some leafage and a little bellflower on the underside of this. And that started off by a drawing and make the cutting out of a pattern so that we could actually cut out the shape of it before we actually do some of the carving. And why we call it low relief carving is because we just lower the background to leave things standing proud in order to you know, give it some interest. We also have things that are sort of a minimum relief carving, which is something similar to this this acanthus leaf, where you remove all the background from around the outside, and then come back with your carving tools and create the you know, the curved shapes and the leaves and the stems and so forth after you've taken the background back. Then we have some high relief carving, which would be like this festoon of flowers and fruit and leaves and so forth, which is, this is a really great piece of work. You know, when you think about it, this piece of wood actually started off about this thick, and they had to remove all that material from around the outside and get it perfectly smooth, and then come back and carve the you know, the ribbons and the leafage, and these looks like apples, and you know, they get some leafage here, and a pomegranate and a pine cone, and you know, just, the imagination is really pretty remarkable. But you know, just to be able to see this in 3 dimension is really you know, pretty amazing. Also, then you might go into what we call carving in the round, like our golden cod here. This is a fish that we did in one of the carving classes one night, where we you know, drew out the shape of the cod, and then everybody had to imagine what the fish actually looked like. You know, we tried to, you know, make, you know, define the mouth and the eyes, the gills, all of the fins on it, and then we did incise carving on all the fins in order to create, you know, that bony structure that actually helps them when they swim. Some other carving in the round is, you know, a ball and claw foot like you see here, and then we have some low relief carving of the acanthus leaves on the knees with some flowers at the top here. And you know, this is a pretty advanced work, especially, you know, we have to be able to cut out the shape of the leg into a block, and then imagine that dragon's claw is inside of this block of wood, and take all the material away that doesn't belong. So, but this is another different style of ball and claw foot, which is a little bit more interesting and more difficult to do, because if you look at the talons on here, you know, they're actually got spaces around them, and there's also a space up underneath here, so that the ball actually looks like it's floating around in there. And some of this work has to be, why it looks so great is because of the undercutting. And the undercutting means that once we develop the claws or the knuckles, we actually curve them slightly so that it really looks as though, you know, they're grabbing a hold of the ball. And then we have some stylized carving on the knee here. Again, this is low relief carving, where we have to remove all the material from around this, so this is just standing proud ever so slightly by a 1/16 of an inch or so. Come back and outline all of our shapes, and then come back and do some incising, and then some slight you know, cuts in the surface to create the leaves. This is based on a Newport piece from the 18th century. The Goddard and the Townsends did this type of a form of carving back in the 18th century. Now, a couple other interesting ones that, you know, from other countries. These are a couple of either wallpaper or fabric, you know, I guess you call them stamps, so that they would ink these things and then, you know, press them onto fabric or paper in order to create a design. And if you look at this one here, it's really intricate. I mean, the amount of work involved in just carving away all the background to leave all these sinewy lines and leaves and flowers and scrolls and so forth is just astronomical. I mean, I can't imagine the amount of work involved in this. And then this piece, of course, this other piece is a little bit more, you know, a heavier relief, and which creates these nice lines, but it's got a lot of the material has been taken away, so that when they, you know, do the stamping, that you don't actually end up with too much, you know, overlay when you actually press it onto the fabric. Okay, let me clear this off, and we'll talk about a couple other pieces of carving. Okay, you know, this is a pretty remarkable piece of work. As you can see, you know, this is a stem of orchids with the leaves. This is carved in basswood or lime. And, you know, some of the greatest carvers in the world, there was a fellow by the name of Grinling Gibbons from England who did, you know, this naturalistic carving in the round like this. And Derek McDonald, one of my full-time students, did this particular piece of work. And he was really inspired by the Grinling Gibbons book when I gave it to him. And, you know, he carved a couple other pieces, and then he came up with this thing, which is pretty remarkable. When you look at the, you know, the flowers on the underside and the detail of them. But one of the interesting things, this isn't one solid piece of wood. These are individual flowers that are carved and then attached to the stem, and the stem is then attached to the leaves and so on and so forth. So it's a buildup of different bits of carving as opposed to being carved from one solid piece of wood. But it's really quite a remarkable piece of work, that's for sure. Well, I'm Phil Lowe at the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is The Art of Woodworking.